Hello and welcome to this Prolific webinar. I'm Sabrina Nordland from Prolific, and I'm joined today by Dr. Stephen Gangestad from the University of New Mexico. Stephen, would you care to introduce yourself?
I'm Steve Gangestad. I'm a professor emeritus now at the University of New Mexico Department of Psychology. I have been involved with the department for well over 30 years, have really enjoyed being part of it. We have a great research group here, and so I'm very lucky to be here.
That's so lovely to hear. And when it comes to your work with Prolific, what was the specific goal of your research? Like, what were you looking to find out?
So for some years, we've been interested in how women's sexual interests in particular, but more generally, they're in the sense psychology, changes across a menstrual cycle. Of course, women can have sex and be interested in having sex, have sexual interest throughout the entire cycle. But something that's quite interesting is that they're actually conceptive only a few days out of that cycle. So that is sex that was unprotected when you're talking about naturally cycling women, so women who would not be on hormonal birth control, not be pregnant, not be breastfeeding, etc. They could potentially conceive an offspring only a few days. And yet you have sex throughout the cycle. In many animal species, mammalian species, this just doesn't happen. So there's interesting questions about, in some sense, what's it for? What's going on with non-conceptive sex? Obviously, the reason that most mammalian females only have sex when they can conceive is sex is about reproduction and partly, and in those species, it's most all about reproduction. So what's the point of having sex outside of the conceptive phase? And of course, the conceptive phase is mostly sort of mid-cycle. Is what it is. It's a few days leading up to ovulation, which occurs about mid-cycle. So for some years, we've just been interested in understanding what goes on across the cycle. It's known that women will, on average, experience more sexual interest or desire when they are conceptive, and many women seem to be aware of this. But that itself doesn't explain still what's going on outside of the cycle, even if there's more of it mid-cycle. So part of what we're interested in is, are there particular differences in what influences women's sexual interest when they're conceptive and when they're not conceptive? Not necessarily things that they're aware of, but can we probe and find out what might be influencing their sexual interest? The particular study that we were doing here is one that involved partnered women. So these are women who all have romantic partners. Most of them in our sample actually were married. And most of them had been with their partners for some time. I think the average was something like 8 years. So in particular here, we're interested in for partnered women, what influences their sexual interest. And one of the reasons why we're interested in that is that there's some ideas out there that non-conceptive sex might have something to do with bonding, that it's way of establishing the bond and solidifying the bond and so on and so forth. But if that's slightly different than what's going on during the conceptive phase, then you might find differences in who and under what circumstances and so on women will have sexual interest. So that's part of what we were interested in probing. I can go into a specific question that we had that was really quite interesting. So women differ, and people differ in general with regard to the qualities of their romantic relationship. Even amongst relationships that are really satisfying and so on and so forth, there might be differences in how attached or how bonded women are to their partners, how sort of central that person is to their own lives, and just how central it is to sort of how crucial that relationship is in their life. There are also going to be differences in how much conflict they have and so on and so forth. And part of what we were interested in here is looking at how that actually influences sexual interest across a cycle. One thing that we had seen in a previous study, but it was just a hint of something, in the sense that, well, we want more than one study to be able to establish this, is that women, when they're strongly bonded to their relationship, what we saw is that, their sexual interest in their partner is actually going to be very concentrated when they actually are conceptive. Again, not that they're thinking about that, but rather under the influence of hormones or whatever it might be, and we do assume that hormones are part of what's influencing this. They seem to be particularly interested in sex when they were conceptive, not so much outside of it. In fact, women who were less bonded, if anything, had more sexual interest, initiated sex with their partners more when they were non-conceptive. And that might be a hint as to what's going on, that's consistent with, well, maybe shoring up bonding and so on is part of what is going on. So the primary goal of this particular study was, and we looked at a variety of things, but one primary goal was to see if this pattern is real and does it replicate. And so that's again, in the larger context of just understanding what's going on with women's non-conceptive sexual interest.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I suppose when it comes to actually screening for participants and the participant demographics there, were you specifically looking for partnered women? Were you looking specifically in the US? Can you tell me a bit more about the actual participants?
Right. So what we did is we had a set of criteria that we wanted women to meet. One is they had to be partnered. They had to be in their relationship for at least 3 months. And again, on average, it was something like 8 years. In fact, very few were less than a year. So it tended to be a very involved sample. We were looking for women who were, of course, naturally cycling. We had an age limit, so they had to be at least 18, but not more than 35. So they couldn't be using hormonal birth control, not pregnant, not breastfeeding. And we also wanted them to be naturally cycling, regularly cycling. So reasonably regular cycles, not cycles that are all over the place in terms of length. So we screened on all of that. Many of those variables were already in the database that Prolific had, so it was easy to identify a subset. But then we had a screening questionnaire that would screen for additional things, such as, for instance, regularly cycle. And then, so we wanted primary English speakers for the most part. And so what we did is we had, we recruited from both the US and the UK. I think about 3/4 of our sample came from the UK.
Interesting. And what type of study was it? So how was it structured? Did you invite them repeatedly?
Right. So the study that we did, and one of the challenges that's involved here is, in essence, it's really kind of a short-term longitudinal study. So what we want to do is we want to get a sampling for each woman of what her sexual interests are and initiation of sex and a variety of things like that across an entire cycle. So what we did is we recruited women. We had them fill out an initial questionnaire of 30 minutes. A lot of that involved, telling us about their relationship, also when their last menses was, and so on, so we could see where they were in the cycle at that time. And then we followed up with, we wanted 30 consecutive days of survey data on the daily reports on how much sexual interest they had, whether they initiated sex with their partner in the last 24 hours, whether they had sex, whether their partners initiated sex, and so on. And as well as then, if they did have an onset of menses, then we wanted to be able to tell us that too, because that helps us identify where they are in the cycle. So yeah, that's what we wanted to do, a short-term longitudinal study. That is challenging. When we've done stuff in the lab, what we often have is women are, they come in and we recruit them sequentially. So one might start on a Monday, then another one starts on a Friday, and then we recruit another one for the next Tuesday, et cetera, et cetera. Here, what we did is we actually ran the study so that all women in sync filled out the daily questionnaires, the 30 daily questionnaires. So day one was the same day one for all women. Day 2, day 3, et cetera, all the way to day 30. And it was absolutely brilliant. And this is part of what sold me on running this study through Prolific, is Andrew came in and said, well, this is a challenge. This is a challenge, but we can do it. And this is how we'll do it. This kind of a short-term longitudinal study. So it just was, it was wonderful. It was really, really wonderful.
I'm glad to hear it. Were there any other parts of Prolific, benefits of Prolific, that made you choose to use Prolific in this case, or was it mainly
Sure.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I was impressed on the website by, the description of the sample, and they seemed to be, a sample that would be relatively involved, reasonably well compensated, and but also, providing good high quality data. I like the fact that Prolific, that it seems to integrate with survey methodologies quite well. We were using Qualtrics, and it just worked beautifully with Qualtrics. But then, what I didn't know from the website is, could you do this kind of a short-term longitudinal study, as opposed to what probably most researchers are doing, which is just a one-shot study. You recruit participants, they fill out a survey, then they're done with the study. You debrief them, and that's it. So here, we wanted to do this short-term longitudinal study, and Andrew let me know, and Andrew got in touch with me after I contacted Prolific and asked if it was feasible, and said, well, this is a challenge, but there's a way to do it. And he was very, seemed to be all in with helping out here. All the communications were clear. And he seemed to think that, well, yeah, this is feasible. Let's talk about it. Let's do it. And so, yeah, like I say, it just worked wonderfully. I did not anticipate when I first contacted Prolific that this is the way it would be done, all data collected sequentially. But it made it so nice, because the study was done in a very short time frame. And when we've done these things in the lab, it might take a year or two to collect the sample that we collected in Prolific in just more than a month. But furthermore, having all the participants participating in sync, filling out the questionnaires in sync, just made it very easy to track just exactly what the participation rates were, just how things were going, and all of that. Now, I might note that on our side, of course, it's the way we think about it, it's a single study, it's a single research project. But on the Prolific side, the way that Andrew did it, and again, it was just brilliant. We had an initial questionnaire that participants had a week to complete after they were invited, after they were screened so that they would be invited. So they had a week to fill that out, and then day one of the daily survey started, and that all went all the way through day 30. All of those individual days were set up as separate studies, so that a separate invitation went out to participants. Of course, they knew that they would just get that every day for 30 days, but it just that's part of what made it feasible, to just set it up as those 30 separate studies. And although the data were collected as individual studies in Qualtrics, it all got integrated into a single data file, and so on. Data management was extremely easy. It was like I said, it was just brilliant.
That's fantastic. And can we talk a bit about the results, or the outcomes, the findings that you had from this project? So what did you learn in the end of those 30 days?
Well, okay, so data analysis is ongoing, so we don't have all the results that we'll ultimately have. But to speak to the question that I laid out earlier, is it the case that women who were more strongly bonded, their sexual interest and so on in their partners tended to be, concentrated during this ovulatory phase. Yes, absolutely. That is what we found. And so that women who were less bonded, actually more of their sexual interest was outside of that conceptive phase, which suggests again that non-conceptive and conceptive phases have somewhat different functions. Again, women may very well not be aware of this. They may or may not be aware of the motives that are driving their interest, but we can see what actually influences it. So I think it's a non-obvious, non-intuitive kind of finding that non-bonded women would actually be initiating more sex outside of that conceptive phase. But I think it's really fascinating, and it fits into, it's one piece of a puzzle that we're trying to put together. So yeah, I was extremely pleased with the data quality. One thing I did mention is the participation rate. So we invited just over 300 participants. We got 294 who actually completed the initial questionnaire. And of course, some after they read the instructions, so on, say, well, I'm not that interested in the study, but 294 were. And then we had at least 280 who completed at least 10 of the surveys. We didn't require that women participate in every single survey because they're going to miss one and we don't want to knock them out for that. So at least, I think it was 280 completed at least 10, and the average was something like 27 out of the 30 surveys overall. We did do a follow-up questionnaire. That was another piece of the research that was a little bit challenging, because what we wanted to get the report of the onset of the next menses. That tells you best where they are when they're actually participating. So we did this follow-up, and it could happen anytime in the next month after those 30 surveys. That was another piece that was challenging, and Andrew was once again wonderful in helping put that together. And so I think we ended up with 97%. We just don't see that in our own lab studies. 97% reported an onset of next menses in that next month or month and a half, which I think is extraordinary. So, yeah, I'm extremely pleased with the quality of the data, what the participation rate, and indeed, yeah, I mean, I'd do it again, and indeed we will do it again. I didn't know that we'd be doing this, but we're planning to do a follow-up sometime later this year.
That's excellent to hear. That's really exciting. Yes. So you're still in the middle of analyzing the data, but you are planning now a follow-up to keep studying.
We're planning on, we're continuing to analyzing the data. One reason why we'll delay the doing the next study is that we want to clarify just what questions we still have. In any study, there's some results that you anticipated, or at least there are some that hopefully you anticipated, you laid out beforehand, some predictions, but there are always wrinkles. And so one of the reasons to do follow-up is to iron out those wrinkles. And so we'll continue with some data analysis before finalizing the design of that study. But like I say, hopefully later this year, we'll be collecting more data and maybe have it by January of 2025.
Very exciting. Well, thank you so much for all of your insights and for your discussion. It was really, really interesting for me. Yeah. Any last thoughts?
No, other than, I highly recommend Prof. It was just a wonderful experience. I might note as well that Andrew helped in setting up the design. It turned out that for very good reason, he took a brief leave. He had a paternity leave for a month, and Victoria stepped in, and it was absolutely seamless. I mean, she was fully informed of what we were doing. Everything just ran completely smoothly while Victoria was standing in for Andrew. So yeah, I'm just extremely pleased with the whole process. Yeah, and the involvement. Yeah, it's great.
I'm really glad to hear that. Well, thank you so much, Steve.